Okay, so in the last video, we got this set up, uh, brought some objects into our scene to work with, created the first macro, which I may periodically say script just out of habit, uh, but the technical term would be macro, and put our 2 units that we always need to worry about in there. So now we're ready to do some stuff. A good start seems to be move the player around the character. Real quick, probably should have mentioned this in the last video. To navigate around the scene, we can use the scroll wheel to zoom in or out, or hold down on the scroll wheel and that pans things around. And if you don't have a mouse with a scroll wheel, well, obviously you should still have scroll capabilities if you're on a touchpad on a laptop. What you can do is hold down the Alt key, and then when you drag around, click and drag around to get that same effect of holding down the clicking on the scroll wheel if you weren't familiar with that. So a good first step would probably be move the character around. See if we can get that to happen. So what do we need to change? Well, we see the information about the player over here in our inspector, and this very top one, the transform attributes of the player. That tells us the position, rotation, and scale. So to move the player, we want to change the position. So we need to change the transform. So we'll come over here and right click to bring up the fuzzy finder, and we want to look for transform. Whoops, just kind of canceled out of there for some reason. We want to look for transform. When we search, it brings up a whole lot of options. So transform, a bunch of different things. Expose, that brings up all the values we have of the transforms. So we'll see exposed stuff before too long. So here's rotation. We don't want to rotate it. Look at, we're not going to just look at it. Get root. Well, translate, here it is. So our term for this is overloading. We overloaded the translate method. So there's lots of versions of translate, and each one we need to pass in different information for it to run. We call those arguments. We need to pass in different arguments. We just want some basic movement. We just want to change the X, Y, and Z. Well, not the Z, just the X and Y axis. So we'll use this basic one. Transform, translate with the X, Y, Z arguments. That brings up this. You can see here's our transform, translate unit, and lots of different nodes that we can work with. So the arrows up here at the top, that indicates where it's going to go in the flow. So like mentioned earlier, the start event runs once. So in order to move it, we need that to happen over and over and over again. So that's something we want to connect to the update event. So we'll connect the node from the update event into the flow node on the transform thing. The next node is, what does it apply to? It's going to apply to itself. And yep, we're connected to the player object, so that's definitely what we want to apply to. And we're in a 2D game, so we just need to change the X and Y axis, X and Y values. We could type something in, but that would just change continuously. So if we click on the X node and drag that out, let's look for an input. Because typically for a game, we would use the A, S, D, or W keys, or maybe the arrows. So we could search for those keys specifically, but we can do something better. We can also refer to an axis. So I'm going to go with this get axis one. But you could also just go with a regular key input. So what an axis is, if we come up to the edit menu and under project settings, you'll see this menu pop up, and under input, well, with input we have different types of inputs. The horizontal input, a vertical input, the fire inputs, the jump inputs, mouse inputs, some of the standard ones. So, and these are already pre-programmed. So like here, the horizontal uses the A and D keys on our buttons, a bunch of different buttons, or if we plugged up a controller, it would tell the computer at that point what the horizontal movement is. So if we use these, the input axes, instead of a specific key, we have a lot more things to work with. and we just need the name for each one. So we type in horizontal or vertical to move it left and right and up and down. That's what we're going to do here. It may be a jump axis or a fire axis and different things that you would want to use. So we can use that instead. We'll close out of this. And so here in our input axis unit, what axis are we looking for? We could type it in right here. But one thing about programming is computers do small things. It seems like computers do a lot, but really computers only do small things. It just does lots and lots and lots of small things. So instead of typing the horizontal axis in here and doing two things in one unit, I'm going to drag out from the input side here and enter a string literal and just type in the string that I want to go there. So I'm going to type in horizontal. So we want to look at the horizontal axis, get the value of that, and feed that into the x value. The one thing, though, is that this is an across-the-board input axis. So anytime we want to move horizontal, whether it's on our keyboard, whether we use the letters or the A or the D keys, the right or left arrows, or we plug in some other controller, that has to work for all of them. So this returns a value between -1 and +1. So 0 if we're not pressing it, and then it moves between the -1 and +1 depending on if the left or right is pressed. But we might not want to move at a speed of 1. So we can do some math and adjust that. So let's bring in a variable with this. So over here in our variable panel, we have different ways we can attach them. So we can attach a variable to the graph we're working in, or attach a variable to the object that we're working on, that graph is attached to. The scene itself, so everything in today's tutorial is going, or this playlist of tutorials is going to use scenes. To keep it simple, we're just going to use global scope for all our variables for the room that we're in. We can also attach it to the game itself. I'm just going to use scene for everything to keep it simple. So to create a variable, we have to enter a name first. Well, if we hit the little plus sign and tried to create it, it would tell us we need a name. So first thing we have to do is put in a name. So we're going to call that speed. And then either hit the plus sign or enter. And I'll bring up this. So if you're not familiar with programming, a variable is a named location in memory. Whoops. So we're going to store something in memory, and we need a way to access it. So this is like giving a name to an address in memory so we can retrieve whatever data we put there. Then what type of thing do we have? Well, the speed is just a number, so let's choose a floating point. And I'll set it to maybe 0.5. And that gives us a value. So now over here, we're going to bring that in. So instead of putting our axis right into the x value, I want to get rid of this line. And notice when I hover over it, it turns yellow. If it turns yellow, you can right click on it and that'll delete it. So instead of doing that, I'm going to drag out from that node. And by default, it wants to do some math. So I'm going to go to multiply. And then we're going to multiply whatever value we get from that axis. So something between -1 and 1. And the variable that we just created, the speed variable. So we could go to the fuzzy finder and look for it. Or once we have the variables, we can just grab them and drag over. If we do that, then we get this unit to get the variable, to get the value of the variable. And alternatively, I'll go ahead and put it here. If we hold the Alt key and drag over, then that gives us the unit to set the variable, to change the value that's stored there. Well, in this case, we just want to get it. So we'll just drag that over here. And that'll give us the value stored in this variable called speed. Multiply it by the input axis, which just tells us which way it's moving. And then it's going to change the x value by that amount. So let's give this a run and see if that works. You always want to test often. Don't wait till you get to the end to check things. Anytime you get to a point you can check stuff, go ahead and do so. So after hitting run, it took a second, but the game eventually loaded back up. And if I push the A key, the character moves to the right. If I push the D key, character moves left. And same thing, left arrow, right arrow. And notice down here in the script, we can see what's being passed, all these connections. So one quick little change here. I'm going to go ahead and stop the game. What happens if we get an error? So maybe I'm going to spell horizontal wrong. So I went in and spelled horizontal wrong. So now there's something wrong there. If I go run this again, you'll notice that this unit turned red. And nothing's flowing through here. I should have pointed out a moment ago, we can see, so that's how we detect errors. Whenever something goes wrong, it'll turn red and flow through. So I'm going to pause the video and change that back to what actually worked. I just wanted to point out that it would turn red and you can see the flow stops, right? We can see what value is flowing there along with the dots. But this one turned red because of the error and there's no value passing on. So again, over here, there's no value to be passed on. Okay, so I went ahead and changed that back to what worked. And so the horizontal movement works. Now we're ready for the vertical movement. Looks like we ran out of room here, right? We can zoom out and get more room, but there might be a better way to do it is if we come over here to some empty space and just double click, it'll maximize the screen. And then when we double click again, it'll minimize it. So that's a good way to go back and forth. Just double click in the empty space. And vertical movement's almost the same. So if we just select all of that, well, first off, select all of that, and then hit Control C to copy, and then Control V to paste it. And that gave us another one that's kind of the same thing. So we can drag this and connect it to the y-axis, and the only thing we need to change is we're not looking at the horizontal axis. We want to look at the vertical axis this time. Everything else should be the same, so let's see if that works. Go over here, give it a run to test it. And so now with this running, if I push the W key, it moves up, the S key, A is moving to the left, D is moving to the right, so all the movement seems to work. So that's a start. So I'm going to go ahead and stop this. And one last thing I want to look at in this tutorial, if we expand this, you can see that everything's working, but all these units we put together in sections, some of them look very similar, right? So some labeling helps. If we hold down Control and draw a box around that, we can group them together and then label it as like horizontal. If I can spell correctly, label it as the horizontal movement. Or same thing down here. Hold Control, draw a box, and label that as the vertical movement, just to keep it organized. Because it'll get big kind of quick. And then we can move those all around as a group once we do that. Or, well, those two movements together encompass all of our movements. So I'm just going to then put those groups in that. So just an organization thing. Hold down Control and draw a box to group stuff together.